Chapter 1. Inquest. "Do you see any prospect of solving this mystery, Mr. Holmes?" she asked, with a touch of asperity in her voice. "Oh, the mystery," he answered, coming back with a start to the realities of life. "Well, it would be absurd to deny that the case is a very abstruse and complicated one. But I can promise you that I will look into the matter and let you know any points which may strike me." "Do you see any clue?" "You have furnished me with 7, but of course I must test them before I can pronounce upon their value." "You suspect someone?" "I suspect myself." "What?" "Of coming to conclusions too rapidly." Whatever one might read in the newspapers, there is not much real distress among biologists about the fundamental idea of biology, which is evolution. There may be arguments still about how and how fast evolutionary changes took place, but that evolution did take place is hardly an issue anymore. The idea that the multitudinous forms of life on the earth have evolved from common ancestors owes its security not to some single demonstration but to a more day-to-day experience of biologists, that this idea fits with innumerable detailed and general observations. In providing a global view of the relatedness of life, it is an idea that makes biology into a coherent subject. Biology has become, quite simply, the study of the causes and effects of evolution, and the question of the origin of life is, first, the question of the origin of evolution. But to frame the matter in this rather stolid way is not to deny that the case of the origin of life on earth is an abstruse and complicated one. There are clues, certainly, many more than Holmes's 7, but their significance is indirect, and the most obvious are not always the most important. We will be thought-testing many of these clues, detecting a number of red herrings, and avoiding coming to conclusions too rapidly. What will emerge will be 7 clues that seem to be of particular use, and an overall view of the origin of life that these clues suggest. Before we can really get started, there are some words to disentangle. First, there is the word life. My dictionary tells me that life is the period between birth and death, but that is not what I want to talk about. This book is about life as a phenomenon, as in life on earth. Life is a property that is shared by man, moulds and marigolds. It is a rather fuzzy property, unfortunately, notoriously difficult to pin down, even if obvious enough in most cases. I prefer uses of the word life that admit the fuzziness, that do not pin down but somehow encompass the general idea. Coleridge's definition is like this. I define life as a whole that is presupposed by all its parts. After all, what impresses us about a living thing is its inbuilt ingenuity, its appearance of having been designed, thought out, of having been put together with a purpose. Life can be thought of as a kind of naturally occurring machinery. We can see what the purpose of a living thing is. It is to survive, to compete, to reproduce its kind against the odds. Coleridge, it must be admitted, was looking for something more poetic than machinery, for some deeply mysterious unifying power, a principle of life, an essential magic about living things that divides them from everything else. That is what we call vitalism. It is officially outmoded, but there are still respected scientists, physicists mainly, who seem to want of life more than machinery, who would seek some profound division. There is a temptation, in any case, to suppose that if the origin of life was not actually supernatural, it was at least some very extraordinary event, an event of low probability, a statistical leap across a great divide. That way a trace of magic can be held on to. I am much more inclined to an opposite prejudice, a majority prejudice now. This is to suppose that the exorcism that Darwin initiated will continue right back to the origin of life. Darwin persuades us that the seemingly purposeful construction of living things can very often, and perhaps always, be attributed to the operation of natural selection. If you have things that are reproducing their kind, if there are sometimes random variations, nevertheless, in the offspring, if such variations can be inherited, if some such variations can sometimes confer an advantage on their owners, if there is a competition between the reproducing entities, if there is an overproduction so that not all will be able to survive to produce offspring themselves, then these entities will get better at reproducing their kind. Nature acts as a selective breeder in these circumstances. The stock cannot help but improve. You can see that natural selection is a good bit more than just survival of the fittest. There are all those ifs. And natural selection is only one component of the mechanism of evolution. Any theory that is to explain the variety and complexity of living things must also take into account the varied and varying challenges set up by a varied and varying environment. Nature, as breeder and show judge, is continually changing her mind about which types should be awarded first prize. Changing selection pressures have been a key part of her inventiveness. But nevertheless, natural selection has been the key component, the sine qua non. Without it, living things could not even stay adapted to a given set of circumstances, never mind become adapted to new ones. Without natural selection, the whole adventure would never have got off the ground. That kind of inbuilt ingenuity that we call life is easily placed in the context of evolution. Life is a product of evolution. Life, then, is not some absolute quality that would have suddenly disappeared. It would have emerged gradually during early evolution. Between the first evolving entities, that first conformed to those ifs, and later forms that did so more cleverly, there would have been no hard line. But who cares? When you can see what is going on in such a progression, you lose interest in erecting picket fences. As I said, life is a fuzzy idea, and it is best left like that. But wait a minute. You may say, do you not need living things to generate life in this way? No. What is needed for evolution is natural selection, and what is needed for natural selection are things that conform to those ifs. There is nothing in the rules to say that such things had to be living. We have an odd view now because all of those things that we are aware of that can evolve, have evolved. So the start of our problem seems clear enough. If we are to come to understand the origin of life, which would have been a gradual emergence, we must first understand the origin of evolution. We must first find things that can evolve but have not yet done so. If indeed there were such things that were in at the start of the evolution, there should still be things like them to be found or made. Organism is another word that can be placed in the context of evolution. Organisms are participants in evolution. More specifically, for our purposes, organisms are prerequisites for evolution. Those first evolvable things that we have just been talking about would not yet have been living, but they would still have been organisms. It might seem that by far the most difficult parts of the problem of the origin of life had already been solved in principle once there was a general understanding of the way evolution works and of the way in which organisms reproduce and pass on characteristics to offspring. Already towards the middle of this century, there were biochemists and others who felt that there might be only a little gap between some bacterium of the kind that could be seen as a somewhat unstructured blob under a microscope, and some still smaller congregation of molecules that might have been a starter organism for evolution. The early 50s were a high point of optimism. The molecular basis of heredity had suddenly been uncovered, and prevailing ideas about conditions on the primitive Earth suggested that the component parts for such molecular machinery would have just been lying about. It was thought that the atmosphere on the early Earth would have been like Jupiter's atmosphere now, that it would have been dominated by gases such as hydrogen, methane, and ammonia. It had been shown that with such gases some of those amino acids that are now found in all organisms can be made fairly easily. Given such pieces, there was always chance to do the rest, and who knows, there might be special effects to be discovered that would reduce the amount of luck that would be needed. The optimism persists in many elementary textbooks. There is even sometimes a certain boredom with the question, as if it was now merely difficult because of an obscurity of view, a difficulty of knowing now the details of distant historical events. What a pity if the problem had really become like that. Fortunately, it hasn't. It remains a singular case, Sherlock Holmes's favourite kind. Far from there being a million ways and detail in which evolution could have got under way, there seems now to have been no obvious way at all. The singular feature is in the gap between the simplest conceivable version of organisms as we know them, and components that the Earth might reasonably have been able to generate. This gap can be seen more clearly now. It is enormous. 3 prime facts. By far the most remarkable fact of this case is already known to readers. Fact 1. There is life on Earth. That there is a profusion of forms of life will not have gone unnoticed either, but it is much less apparent that this profusion is, biochemically, somewhat superficial. If you could use a big enough magnifying glass, you would find that there is really only one kind of life on the Earth. The most central machinery in all organisms is built out of the same set of microcomponents, the same set of small molecules. We have then fact 2. All known living things are at root the same. But the fact that causes all the trouble is this one, fact 3. All known living things are very complicated. While it may be so that several of the common microcomponents are fairly simple molecules in themselves, they collaborate in a way that is both highly organized and complex. This in itself might be dismissed with a waving hand as a product of evolution. Of course, things would have been much simpler to start with. But the real trouble arises because too much of the complexity seems to be necessary to the whole way in which organisms work. Our kind of life is high-tech. Even some of those essential microcomponents are not at all easily made. We will be returning to the perplexities of fact 3. Questions of time and circumstance. The Earth is 4.5 billion, that's 1,000 million years old. This is quite a reliable figure. The ages of many ancient rocks are reliable too, and they go back a long way. There are rocks in Greenland that are 3.8 billion years old. The first signs of life in ancient rocks are not so easily dated or identified, but there is good evidence now for the microbes of some sort that have been living on Earth for at least 2.8 billion years. This is a cautious estimate. Most experts would say there is now pretty good evidence for life on the Earth 3.5 billion years ago. A few would put the date as far back as 3.8. The most direct evidence is twofold. First, there are rather curious large-scale structures in many ancient rocks, including 3.5 billion-year-old Australian rocks that resemble structures, stromatolites, that today are produced by large colonies of microbes. And then second, they are objects found in ancient rocks that appear to be fossils of microbes themselves. Moving to the other end of the time range of the origin of life on the Earth, the earliest possible date is fixed by the age of the Earth itself, but there is evidence from the Moon and other planets that the Earth was being bombarded by very large meteorites up to about 4 billion years ago. So the long stop is perhaps nearer 4 than 4.5 billion years ago. On the other hand, the cautious 2.8 date for the near end of the range is likely to move further away with new evidence, so probably the gap will narrow. But in the meantime we can be content with a time range of 4.5 or less to 2.8 or more billion years ago for the origin of life on the Earth. As for the conditions on the Earth when life originated, the best evidence that we have is from the Greenland rocks, 3.8 billion years old. That date is well within our range for the origin of life. The rocks themselves speak of an Earth that was not so vastly different from today. These rocks used to be sediments. They were laid down under large bodies of water. And there was presumably land too, to provide the materials to be sedimented. The Greenland rocks contain carbonates, so there was presumably carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And also iron, containing sediments of a kind that, most probably, could only have been formed if there had been little or no free oxygen in the atmosphere. And it is generally supposed that there was also nitrogen in the early atmosphere to provide the main constituent, as now. Of that early, heavy, Jupiter-like atmosphere, full of methane, ammonia, and such things, there is no evidence from ancient rocks, and there is little enthusiasm for the idea now, either among geologists, geochemists, or planetary astronomers. Finally, let us look briefly at 4 extreme attitudes of the sort that tend to obliterate further enquiry. Was the law broken? It is a sterile stratagem to insert miracles to bridge the unknown. Soluble problems often seem to be baffling to begin with. Who would have thought 1,000 years ago that the size of an atom or the age of the earth would ever be discovered? Poor Dr. Watson was always being baffled by Sherlock Holmes's cases, as we are all by a good conjuring show. It is silly to say that because we cannot see a natural explanation for a phenomenon, that we must look for a supernatural explanation. It is usually silly anyway. With so many past scientific puzzles now cleared up, there have to be very clear reasons not to presume natural causes. Let us not say that the law was broken. Was there a freak event? We touched on this already. The argument goes along these lines. If the universe is infinite in time or space, then any circumstance with a finite probability will happen, an infinite number of times to boot. Hence, the first organism could have appeared on Earth by chance. That no life has been found elsewhere in the universe can be taken as evidence in support of this contention. This is the scientifically respectable version of the special miracle. It is just as sterile. If life could have started with a freak event, then that is the way it would have started. Was there a frame-up? Then there is an idea developed particularly by Brandon Carter, railed the anthropic principle. We must be in a universe that made our existence possible. So the universe that we are in may very well be a freak universe self-selected from myriads of others, or some might say specially contrived by God. According to this idea, the laws and constants of nature and all the initial conditions for the universe were, in effect, tuned to allow the production of conscious beings. Maybe so, but as with the freak event idea, there is no real let-out. However contrived our universe may be, we should be looking for the least improbable way in which life could have started within that universe. Was it an outside job? Perhaps life did not start on the earth, but seeds of some sort arrived from elsewhere. In the early part of this century, the Swedish chemist Svante Arrhenius speculated that the pressure of light waves could have pushed spores from one planetary system to another. Alternatively, meteorites have sometimes been suggested as carriers, buried spores being thus protected on their journeys from destructive radiation. There are practical questions of whether in fact spores would survive such journeys, or be likely to find another locale suited to them. The idea suffers, too, from the objection that the problem is simply being displaced. At least we know that life can thrive on the earth. On the face of it, the earth then seems as good a place as any to try to imagine the origin of life. More recently, Fred Hoyle and Chandra Wickramasinghe have speculated that in the vast reaches of interstellar space conditions may be particularly suited to the origin of life. Space then might be full of spores that had never been on a planet. Perhaps, though, such space-borne organisms could nevertheless infect a planet such as the Earth. This time the problem is being displaced more radically, by introducing the idea that perhaps space would be a better place for the critical initial phases of an evolutionary process. But that point is not at all clear, and it is not clear either that organisms that had evolved in space would survive under the very different conditions of a planetary surface. There are similar attractions and snags about the notion that comets or meteorites might have been starting places for evolution. Francis Crick and Leslie Orgel have thought of a third idea, directed panspermia. Perhaps we are the outcome of a research project of some other intelligent beings. Perhaps the Earth was deliberately seeded at some point in the remote past. Again, there is a displacement here. How did the intelligent beings evolve? Verdict. Now I cannot deny all these possibilities. Life on the Earth may be a miracle, or a freak, or an alien infection. And I agree that the confidence was misplaced that supposed in the 50s that the answer to the origin of life would appear in some footnote to the answer to the question of how organisms work. Something much more will be needed, something odd, It is a difficult judgment at such times to say which speculations are reasonable and which go really too far. And we need some sense of direction. We need to eliminate some paths if we are to pursue any with any seriousness. So my verdict on this inquest you can take, at least at this stage, to be no more than pragmatic opinion. It is that life originated on this earth some 3 or 4 billion years ago from natural causes. That is a very conventional verdict nowadays, but the singular aspect of this case, that apparent gap at the start of evolution, will nevertheless lead to a view of the origin of life that is not at all conventional. Of course, if Dr. Mortimer's surmise should be correct, and we are dealing with forces outside the ordinary laws of nature, there is an end of our investigation. But if we are bound to exhaust all other hypotheses before falling back upon this one,